Welcome everyone to this APEN webinar for the 15th of June 2020. Our presenter today is Fiona McCartney, a Senior Social Scientist with the Queensland Department of Environment and Science. The majority of her work relates to understanding the motivations and barriers behind people's actions to inform the behaviour change required to achieve policy objectives in a range of environmental, natural resource management and agricultural contexts. Examples of recent policy objectives include understanding farm use decision making and the adoption of best practices in agriculture, exploring the factors influencing drought preparedness and management in grazing enterprises, increasing farmer participation in natural resource management incentive schemes, complying with environmental regulations, improving decision support tools to increase user adoption, and improving evidence-based policy making. In this presentation, Fiona will explore the drivers and barriers influencing graziers' decisions with respect to drought preparation and management. Furthermore, she will discuss some examples of how findings and insights from social and behavioural science can assist extension practitioners with their approaches and activities. Over to you, Fiona.
So thank you. I just wanted to start by saying thank you to APEN for the opportunity to present this work that our team, myself and my former colleague Gillian Paxton worked on. I'll just give you a bit of an overview of the two projects that I'm going to talk about today. So the first one is a project that I actually conducted back in 2017, and it was understanding the factors limiting decision making for improved drought preparedness and management. And for that particular project, I spoke to rural specialists, so specialist service providers in the grazing industry, as well as actually a small group of leading graziers as well. And then as part of that, we were again looking at the barriers and benefits, and we focused on 3 case study areas within Queensland that align with grazing, DAF grazing areas. So the Mulgaland, Central Queensland and the Gulf Country. And as also, as part of that project, I looked at some decision support tools, and concurrent to the interviews also delivered a quantitative survey asking for feedback about a range of tools, but I'm going to talk primarily about the interviews today. And the second piece of work I'm going to talk about is, actually I'll just go back a slide, is a second piece of research that our team has conducted through the Drought and Climate Adaptation program. But I think I'll focus on DCAP 1 first. So what we found was that drought preparation is complex and encompasses many factors, and these factors are interconnected, that there is no one size fits all, and for every grazing enterprise, and this will be no surprise to any of you, but for every grazing enterprise, which is very unique, their approach of what makes most sense to them in terms of drought management and preparation is going to be different. You know, in some cases it's about fiscal conservatism, in some cases it's about focusing more on the grazing land management practices. Ideally, you would like both. The other thing we found when I spoke to specialists and leading graziers is that there was a definition between what was termed a short-term dry, which is up to 2 years, and under those circumstances, it was felt that by and large, most graziers managed quite well with those short-term dry periods. But once you got past the short term and you looked at the long-term dry periods, which was, you know, roughly over 2 years, it became very, very difficult, if not impossible, to adequately prepare and manage for drought. So because this is a government program and it was funded by government, there was a real focus on looking at the factors, in particular the barriers limiting drought decision making and preparedness. And so for ease of reporting, I categorized those into 6 different areas, but I just wanted to comment, or to make the comment that these are all interconnected. It's never as simple as discrete areas. They all interact with each other. So what are these 6 areas? I'll just pull them all up. and then I'll talk about each one individually. So there was the financial and economic situation, the nature of grazing production systems, the management and record keeping focus, personal attitudes and circumstances, individual knowledge, willingness and capacity to learn and change, and also government involvement. So when we look at the financial and economic situation, this was one of the biggest factors or areas that was seen to be limiting decision making for drought, which again is probably not a surprise to many of you. And within that, both the specialists and the graziers spoke about 3 different areas. The financial pressure that graziers are already under, the fact that in many cases they're carrying a lot of debt, combined with declining terms of trade over time. In some cases, insufficient or economies of scale, so smaller enterprises just contribute to that debt and also the financial pressure. And then depending on where you are in Queensland, a lack of access to off-farm income and a reliance on cattle and only cattle for cash flow was also contributing to that, along with international market restrictions. So the live export ban was a topic that was discussed many times during this project. Combined with financial pressure was also perceptions of quite poor financial literacy amongst not all, but some of the graziers within the Queensland grazing industry. And I guess I should really point out that because it's such a broad group that covers so many different circumstances, none of these things are specific to, none of this applies to all graziers, but to some. So there are some graziers who have very good financial literacy, as those of you who work with graziers I'm sure are aware. And so then when you look at the consequences of both poor financial literacy and financial pressure for drought and drought preparedness and management, it was found that there was limited cash for drought proofing, when you're looking at things like infrastructure or changing practices, or maybe looking at, more fences so that you can separate your stock. But it also led to overgrazing, including not destocking or not destocking early enough during drought because of this need to meet existing financial commitments. So the second area that really was discussed a lot was actually the uniqueness of grazing production systems. So the actual nature of the grazing production systems themselves. So within that, there was this perception, the interviewees that I spoke to felt that there was a perception within the industry that grazing ecosystems are very resilient, and perhaps a perception that they're more resilient than they actually are. And this is because of the subtlety of landscape change and landscape degradation that can occur in grazing production systems, because of the long time window of production systems, and the difficulty with seeing cause and effect when you compare it with other primary production enterprises such as irrigated agriculture or horticulture or broadacre cropping. There's sometimes the perception that grazing systems are actually are more resilient than they actually are, because there still seems to be a lot of green, or the pasture comes back quickly, but those, as many of you know, the diversity of the species has declined, or the number of tussocks has changed, which then impacts, or decreased, which then impacts the land condition. Again, these long cattle production cycles were also seen to contribute to that, just because, well, not just because, but because the cause and effect is so subtle over time that it can be really hard to even notice that cause and effect. So because it can often take several years from when you mate your cattle right through to when you might sell, your cattle, it can be quite difficult, or unless you're looking for it, to see the changes over the time. However, one of the aspects of grazing system, which is both a pro and a con for drought management, is the actual flexible decision windows that can occur. So the flexible decision windows, compared with other primary production enterprises, like for example, when you sell your cattle, is much more flexible than, say, having to harvest a crop at a particular time. The issue though with flexible decision windows is that it can often lead to delayed decision making, and in particular delayed destocking decisions. So, sometimes graziers and land managers are making decisions to hold on for a little bit longer in anticipation of perhaps rainfall that they think may be about to come. And then, this ultimately degrades the system, which then over time reduces the enterprise's ability to withstand drought, both within that drought and into the longer term as well. Management focus encompasses things like record keeping, planning, and decision-making systems. So again, specialists spoke about how there was a very strong focus on day-to-day or operational management focus, as opposed to perhaps a more longer-term strategic focus. And then a very strong focus on cattle and cattle management. Again, sometimes that same focus wasn't on pastures and landscapes and stewardship. And so when the focus is on cattle and you're not focusing on the longer term impacts that might be having on your landscape, then that again is going to limit your ability to make decisions to prepare for drought, both current drought and then into the future. Low levels of record keeping were acknowledged or spoken about, and minimal planning, and some of that connects to that day-to-day focus and operation, very much focused on the operational aspects of the business. And then as part of that, but also we'll probably discuss a bit later, was that combined with the ongoing stress of drought is the compromised decision making that can actually occur, and there's lots of evidence and literature from stress management literature about under stress people make compromised or less adequate, less ideal decisions. I'm just going to shift to the other side and come back to government involvement. So personal attitudes and circumstances was another area that was discussed. So within that, it was thought that some graziers had a disempowering attitude towards drought. So, comments that were made were sometimes some graziers thought, how can you prepare for drought, or we'll just get through, I'll just keep going. And again, this kind of hope and perhaps reliance on, rain occurring, even if there is no evidence that rain is about to occur. And that this sort of focus on something that's outside of your control is actually quite disempowering, and actually can help contribute to limiting decision making when it comes to drought management and preparation. Other personal attitudes and circumstances that were seen to consider to interact or influence decision making and to limit it was if there was an intention to sell. So if there was an intention to leave the property, whether to retire or to leave the enterprise, then some of those decisions for the longer term benefits of the property were not being taken into account to the same degree. Complex family or relationship decision-making dynamics. So who were the decision makers, whether there was multi-generational enterprises, and how decisions were made. The finite physical capacity and increasing exhaustion and health issues that are occurring as with all primary production enterprises or sectors, graziers are aging, and then under drought conditions, they work extremely long hours. It's very physically demanding. They're exhausted, and then added to that are the health issues of exhaustion, but also mental health, which has been spoken about a fair bit, the consequences of drought on mental health and stress and depression. And then, of course, rural suicide. Combined with that is also the limited social interactions that occur. So lots of the specialists and also the graziers, the leading graziers I interviewed, spoke about how over time the number of social interactions has declined because of a whole number of different reasons, but decreasing farm labour, and that has led to less leisure time for a lot of producers. And then added to that is what I was saying before about under drought conditions. Graziers are working very long hours to check waters, to drive around the property to make sure the cattle are okay. And this again means that there's limited time for social interactions, which then contribute to their stress, which then influences their decision making. Another area that was discussed was knowledge, willingness, and capacity to learn and change. So within that, it links back, as I said before, these all interconnect with each other. It was thought that, and again, not for all graziers, but for some graziers, there was a limit to, they had limited land and pasture management knowledge and skills, that many graziers are very experienced cattle people and have very good understanding of their cattle and a real love for their cattle, but not all graziers have that same interest or knowledge set when it comes to their pastures. So understanding, 3P grasses, and also, being able to recognise species diversity within their pasture, and then the impact that has on how they manage those pastures, and again, not recognising that the property is, that the condition of the land is degrading over time. And then within that, I acknowledged that there was a variable willingness to learn and to change. So, and then a variable capacity to learn and to change. And again, some of that is attitudinal, some of that is, people at certain stages of the life cycle having a relatively small or short time frame in which they are going to be staying on their property, and perhaps not having succession arrangements for next generations coming on. So the focus being a bit more on sticking with what they know, rather than perhaps being interested or willing to learn new skills. And then also the case of, some graziers perhaps thinking that they had a good understanding of their pastures and their land management, but perhaps not to an extent that's really needed. The final area that we talked about was government involvement. And within that, it was broken up into drought assistance, to extension and independent service provision, and the seasonal climatic forecasting tools that I mentioned before. So within drought assistance, there was a real distinction made between the Commonwealth and Queensland drought assistance. And there was also a bit of concern that with Queensland, some of the drought subsidies might actually be encouraging a culture of expectation, and even possibly rewarding poor practices by discouraging drought preparedness. So, for example, the emergency water rebate, while it's generally very well perceived within the industry, there was concern that what it did was it potentially discouraged people. It acted as a, it didn't reward people who'd already invested the time and effort in infrastructure, but also led to, in some cases, graziers using that grant to graze paddocks that they perhaps wouldn't have to the extent that they wouldn't have without water. So that can be a good thing for your property, but in terms of degradation for the land and long-term drought management, it might lead to actually, reducing or resulting in destocking happening later than it perhaps needed to. So there was a concern that perhaps it actually prolonged the existence of unviable practices and also unviable farming enterprises. There's also a bit of a concern that it might actually be a bit unfair to other rural small businesses who were also adversely affected by drought. So, you know, a bit of concern about why are graziers, why are primary producers getting this when, you know, the local newsagent isn't accessing the same resources, or the cafe, or, you know, local businesses. So, you know, is that really fair, and is that really appropriate? Within extension and independent service provision, it was generally thought that there was a lot of information and training resources and workshops available, but that there's still not enough graziers accessing that extension or under using some of those best management practices. And this particular research was conducted prior to the grazing best management practice modules being removed in Queensland. So when they were talking about grazing best management practices, they were talking about some of those ones that were advocated within that program. However, and this is probably again no surprise to you as extension officers, that there was still a great demand for more one-on-one extension support and service provision within Queensland grazing. There was also some stuff that came out about the seasonal climatic forecasting tools, but I just don't have enough time, and I want to get onto something else today, so that focuses on extension. So if people are interested a bit more in the seasonal climatic forecasting tools, you can talk to me afterwards. I'm more than happy to talk to you about that. So the next project that I wanted to mention was, again, another social research project, and this came about because when Gillian Paxton, my former colleague, undertook this research, and Gillian found that when she was looking at my research, which was again looking at specialists, she was really interested in the stuff to do with community attitudes and culture, and so she wanted to explore the cultural context around drought and resilience, and then how some of those insights can be used for drought extension and policy. And so as part of that, she conducted some more social research. This was with graziers themselves. And then the second part of the Drought and Climate Adaptation program is a knowledge support role that I'm delivering, which is where I provide social and behavioural scientific knowledge support to, again, the design and delivery of decision support tools, and also grazing extension services and practices. And the knowledge support role came about because when I conducted the research for the first Drought and Climate Adaptation project, I thought there were many insights that have come from other areas of social and behavioural research that are not necessarily from agriculture or natural resource management. Like, they could come from communities or housing, you know, different methods, different theories, different techniques, different insights, so different concepts that I thought were relevant, but to date haven't really been explored in the natural resource management and agricultural area. So as part of writing up the project proposal, we said we would do some more social research, but we also wanted to provide this social and behavioural scientific support. So Gillian has finished her social research component. She finished up at the end of last year. But my work is ongoing, and it's 2 days a week. So roughly 1 day a week, working with DES, Department of Environment and Science, scientists with their decision support tools, and grazing extension staff through DAF. So Gillian's research aim was to explore the cultural factors and context that might complicate or constrain drought preparedness and the drought preparedness mindset in Queensland. And then just to explain culture is the shared or taken for granted ways that particular social groups, and in this case it could be communities, organisations, industries and enterprises, live and operate together. It can include things like shared beliefs, knowledge, values, practices, and then material things as well, so tools and technologies. In order to take this research, Gillian looked at doing two different things. So she conducted a discourse analysis with media articles because she wanted to understand the way in which drought and drought resilience and preparation was being presented in the media. So she looked at a number of different media sources within Queensland, but primarily ones within a rural focus, so Queensland Country Life, ABC Rural, ABC General, and the Courier Mail. And the reason why she thought discourse, an understanding of the way that drought and drought resilience and preparation is presented, is that, you know, those messages can influence what we believe to be possible and desirable, and thus how we think and ultimately how we act. The second method that Gillian used was similar to what I had done with the first project, which was looking at in-depth interviews, but this time with graziers. I had just had a small group of leading graziers and specialists, who are specialist service providers, but Gillian focused on working with graziers themselves and interviewing graziers themselves. So she looked at things like their goals and values and how they saw themselves, how they understood drought and drought preparation, where they drew knowledge from to respond to drought and comprehend future drought risk, and also whether and how they could be supported, particularly from a government perspective. So she found that there were 9 cultural factors that complicate drought preparedness. There were competing messages about drought, multiple and complex motivations driving graziers, perceived distinction between drought and climate change, a reliance on more traditional forms of knowledge, a remaining distrust of seasonal climate forecasting, difficulty managing uncertainty, social constraints on innovation and adaptation, limited awareness of the full spectrum of drought preparation practices, and expectations for drought support. I'm going to go through each of them, not all of them in great detail, but the ones that I think are probably most relevant to extension. So with respect to competing messages about drought, when Gillian undertook her media analysis and looked at thousands of media articles, she identified 2 different ways in which drought was framed or presented, and she called them the battling adversity framing and the managing business risk framing. And the reasons why this is important to graziers is, to extension officers, is that it gives you a bit of an insight into how graziers, you know, are perceiving drought, and therefore then the approaches that you take. But the other thing that Gillian really wanted to highlight was that the battling adversity framing was far, far more prevalent than the managing business risk framing. So you were much more likely to see images and messages about this battling adversity. And within that, drought was seen as, you know, a natural event that created difficulty and disadvantage. It presented graziers in almost an adversarial relationship with drought, and there are some quotes from her report which sort of use warlike analogies to explain how graziers manage drought. Drought management was seen as a bit of, you know, as fortifying, fighting, enduring, or gambling, and then drought support could be found by rallying communities, charities, and sympathetic politicians. The reason why this is a, you know, it can be a bit of a problem is quite similar to what we were saying before in the DCAP 1, that some of these attitudes can actually be quite disabling for graziers, disempowering for graziers. And so therefore, you know, even though it's a much more common message that's presented in the media, it's not necessarily the most empowering message that graziers can hear and need to hear about drought. In contrast, the managing business risk framing was the second frame that was presented in the media. This was more likely to be in the media and also on government websites like DAF and DES and to a lesser extent industry websites. And that was that drought was seen as one of many ongoing and manageable risks facing graziers, that graziers can engage professionally with drought, that drought management is a matter of rational and strategic planning and decision making, and that drought support is available in terms of knowledge, scientific expertise and information to help manage risk and through some of those decision support tools. What I found quite interesting about this is that when I was looking at some of the resilience literature, and Gillian found the same thing, there seems to be two different points of view about resilience. One sort of focuses on managing the status quo, and that battling risk adversity, sort of fortifying and pulling through and you know, sort of surviving the drought so you can get back to the way that things have always happened or have always happened or been done, really aligned with that, as opposed to the other aspect of resilience, which kind of looks at a lot more at adaptation and an adaptive capacity and capacity to change and change over time. And that second, managing business risk framing, was much more aligned with that. However, the way that the information was presented in the media and the different sources was also a bit of an issue that we found. So the battling adversity framing was much more prevalent, but it was also, there was a lot more emotive language used. Stories were told, you know, of the hardship that people faced. And we know from, you know, literature and other areas that storytelling is a very powerful way of getting messages across, and you're much more likely to remember stuff if it's told in a story. Unfortunately, the managing business risk framing was quite dry. It was quite bureaucratic in its language and its approach, basically a little bit boring to read in some cases, not all, but in some cases. And so I think there's an opportunity here, not just as extension officers, but from a government perspective too, which is what this project was part of, to look at the way that we communicate about some of this stuff, and that maybe we need to learn about some of the ways, you know, there's a whole area within behavioural science which looks at behaviourally informed communication, where we look at things like, you know, appealing to people's values and motivations and using emotive language and really linking stories. And perhaps there's ways that we need to be looking at, you know, getting the good message of managing business risk across, but in a less bureaucratic way and in a way that is more appealing to people. So this table basically stresses that the battling risk adversity frame had a very high cultural appeal with its rich, descriptive and powerful messages. But unfortunately, it's not the best message in that it doesn't empower graziers and really emphasises the power of drought. And management was much more about enduring and fighting rather than actually adapting and changing to improve your systems over time. Again, the managing business risk framing was a much better message, but the language had very low cultural appeal. So one of the things that I have been looking at as a consequence of that through the knowledge support role is, are there ways that we can try to improve not just extension materials, but government materials that we put out through communication channels or policy documents that actually really tap into some of what we know are good ways to communicate that don't alienate your audience and also appeal to a broad range of values. So not just focusing on economic, but also looking at you know, some of the other values that influence graziers. And so on that note, the second thing that Gillian looked at was the complex motivations driving graziers. So whilst financial security was important and identified as important, and again, it's important to note that this was financial security rather than just pure financial profit-driven financial self-interest. It was about securing families for their continuation on the land. But some of the other values and motivations driving graziers was improving livestock and the property, self-direction and creativity, connecting with animals and land, and honouring history, tradition and rural communities. And when I was talking in the previous slide about, you know, perhaps changing the way that we present information about drought preparedness so that we tap into people's values, this is some of the stuff that we're talking about, you know, tapping into people's values about grazing because, you know, they like the self-direction and creativity and entrepreneurship of, you know, being their own boss and making their own decisions. Tapping into their love of animals and their connection with their land, for many, which has been in their families for many generations. A real desire to improve livestock. You know, we talk, you know, a lot of graziers, you know, love the genetics and looking at improving their stock, but also looking at improving their property, honouring their families, their history, traditions, and then rural families and communities in general. So not just focusing on the financial benefits of, not just having our drought management messages focusing on the financial benefits and profits of managing for drought, but actually looking at, you know, some of these other values and linking them more closely with our communications as well. So the other areas, I won't go into it in as much detail, but they were things like a perceived distinction between drought and climate change. So even though drought, whilst it was difficult, it was often seen to be part of a normal part of a balanced cycle, and that the impact of climate change was often dismissed, with other threats, you know, considered to be more pressing. A reliance on more traditional forms of knowledge was another cultural factor that complicated drought preparedness. So some graziers are active knowledge seekers, and again, you know, we can't generalise, but others seem to be more reliant on their own experience, coupled with heuristics or rules of thumb, some of which may have been might be outdated and based on old climate patterns. And this can be quite problematic, especially when, you know, change is occurring and you know, there's a lot of complex decision making involved. So not incorporating some of these newer forms of knowledge into your decision making. There continued to be a strong distrust in some graziers of seasonal climate forecasting. Generally, people agreed that it had improved over time, but some thought that it was still quite inaccurate. And some of that might be caused by the fact that the way that forecasts are actually communicated. So, you know, the use of probabilities can sometimes give people an expectation of what might occur because they're not understanding or interpreting probabilities in the correct way. And that, you know, can lead to false optimism. And then, you know, if it doesn't, if what you're expecting doesn't occur, that can actually make you even more distrustful. But then there is also some issues with the ongoing, you know, with the timing and accuracy of forecasts. And again, you know, like I was saying, if you've had a history where you've expected something and the forecast hasn't delivered, that can actually lead to you know, a much greater distrust. So one of the ways that we've tried to look at, you know, improving this kind of trust or at least willingness to consider seasonal climate forecasts is by trying to improve people's understanding of probabilities and percentiles. And I'll talk a little bit about a project that I've worked on with that.
Fiona, Graham here. 5 minutes.
Okay, all right. So the sixth area was managing uncertainty. So even though graziers with established, so there's, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty involved in drought, and that can make people a bit concerned. And even graziers who had established strategies and decision-making rules for managing drought were concerned, you know, that they might not be making the right decisions, even if they were following the correct process, you know, for making those decisions. Social constraints on innovation and adaptation were also seen as a cultural factor that was complicating drought preparedness. And so within that, it was things like some graziers feeling like they were out on a limb within their local communities if they wanted to talk about drought management, because the social norms around discussing business or discussing climate risks and drought were so ingrained. and also that sort of reluctance to challenge the old ways of doing things. Again, there was a limited awareness of the full spectrum of drought preparation practices, which links back to the project that I had done. Again, there's a much more stronger focus on the cattle and animal aspects of grazing, and a little less, well, significantly less on the pastoral side. So the grazing and the pastures and the soil management. So that, you know, again, that again limits people's ability to make the best decisions when preparing for drought and managing for drought. And then finally, expectations of drought support, which again link back to what I found, which is that sometimes these government subsidies can actually legitimise practices, and also you know, discourages people from looking at new ways or other ways, or perhaps putting in place infrastructural improvements earlier. So the behavioural knowledge support role, I'm just going to talk about quite quickly because I don't have a lot of time, but I looked at a whole range of different areas in which I might be able to provide support both to tool developers and extension officers. So the first area was looking at methods. So looking at social science methods of observation or surveys, focus groups, interviews. And then I looked at quite a number of concepts. I developed a number of databases of concepts that I thought might be useful. I drew on insights from behavioural economics and social psychology primarily, but to a lesser extent, human or user-centred design, social marketing, and then the behaviourally informed communication techniques, which I mentioned before. The other area that I also looked at, and I'm continuing to look at because how long is a piece of string, this is a very broad area, is that there are quite a number of behaviour change interventions which have got a very strong evidence base from other industries and other sectors, whether that be health or housing or communities, that actually could be applied to behaviour change within agriculture and extension and natural resource management extension. And so again, it was about pulling together a database and then systematically going through with either the tool developers and particularly the extension officers when and how you might use some of those interventions. So behavioural insights is just another tool in the toolbox of behaviour change techniques that we have for influencing behaviour change. Within government, we have regulation, but there's also market-based instruments or incentives and information and knowledge provision. And then behavioural insights provides another tool. Generally, behavioural insights are quite inexpensive, and they can also be quite easy to implement. So things like message framing prompts, commitment devices, using if-then plans. So I think there's some real opportunities within extension to kind of look at them and use them without too much expense, too much risk, and too much effort. Now, I just wanted to quickly finish up by giving you a couple of examples of the ways, a couple of diverse examples of the ways in which I've used the knowledge support role for both the extension officers and for the tool developers. So as I mentioned before, one of the main issues affecting the use of decision support tools was this distrust of the accuracy. And it's been discussed many times and thought about many times, and what's been identified is that many users, both graziers and sometimes extension officers and all range of different users of decision support tools and of seasonal climate forecasting tools actually don't have a good understanding of probabilities. So as part of that, we looked at developing a rainfall percentile animation, which some of you may have seen, but some of you may not have. So if not, I've put a link to that. We used an animation and storytelling approach. So looking at some of those behaviourally informed communication techniques to tell a story. We conducted it within a grazing context. So it's a couple of graziers talking about how you understand percentiles to then be able to use that to understand your seasonal climate forecasting tools. And then it links back to the forage reports that Queensland government puts out through the Long Paddock website, but it's a standalone percentile that could be used just to understand percentiles. We've gotten very good feedback about that, so much so that we've actually just started two more animations within that series. And the second area that I wanted to talk about, which I think might be quite relevant, I'm actually going to skip over this one, is to actually talk about a customer journey mapping workshop that I conducted with extension officers in southwest Queensland. So those particular extension officers were really keen to look at the adoption of early weaning within the graziers in their area. And so customer journey mapping is a technique that's existed for a long time within the marketing and social marketing area. And it's basically a systematic process to document and understand the different steps or stages on a journey that a person may take or undertake, in this case towards undertaking early weaning. And the reason why I thought it would be quite useful for extension officers is it's very systematic. And then as part of the actual process, you first of all start by talking about all of the different steps, and then you start to narrow it down to what they call touch points. And that's the points along the journey where there's interaction with extension officers, because really there's no point in focusing on those aspects or those parts of the journey that graziers take if it's not something that you can influence or you know, provide support for. So we looked at the touch points, and then we looked at what we call channels. So the methods of interaction, whether it be through word of mouth or social media or fact sheets or web sheets or webinars or phone calls. Then along each way, we looked at what we called pain points, so barriers or frustrations or annoyances that make it difficult for graziers to take that next step. And then looking at what could be done to try and minimize or limit those pain points. And then the next part of that was to look at the gain points. So what are the positive or enjoyable things along those steps that extension officers could enhance or make better or make easier as a way of making it easier ultimately for graziers to take that step towards early weaning. And so out of that, the extension officers came up with a list, and those post-it notes sort of indicate it, of different methods and techniques along different parts of the touch points. And so the touch points are if you look at the bottom right screen, are the ones in felt pen, and then the suggestions are the post-it notes underneath. So quite a lot came out of that, but there's been some papers that have been written about customer journey mapping, and there's one that's been written within an extension framework just last year, and I think it has some potential. So I think I've put that in my references, but also if anyone wants to talk to me about that, I'm happy to talk to them. So oh no, I don't have it in my references. I'll send a list of references about that to you, Graham, so you can forward it on. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes, thanks Fiona. I do have a few questions that have been asked, and I'll actually just raise these now. And if anyone's got any other questions, feel free to just put details in the chat so that we can get to those. A couple of questions that go back a little bit to the start, Fiona. There was a question about how many interviewees there were. Now, I think there was 55 in the first interviews that you did with researchers.
That's right, yes. There was 55 in the first, and there was 40 grazing households in the second one. So sometimes...
Those 55 included some identified graziers who were... how do you describe those again? Sorry. I think
leading graziers. So they were identified, yeah. So the 55 included about, I think it was 9 leading graziers, and the rest were specialists. And this covered a whole range of different areas. So from a productivity and profitability perspective, so agronomists as well as farm financial counsellors and financial planners. So it covered this sort of a whole range of different types of specialists who had different insights.
Great. And these, and just for my edification, the grazing sector, were they geographically spread across the state or northern Queensland, or how was that the grazing businesses?
So we use the 3 regions again: southwest, or the Mulga lands, central west, and then the north, so the Gulf country. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Thanks for that. Another question here is in regards to, you made a comment in regards to the removal of the best practice material. Did you want to elaborate on that at all? Or,
well, I'm not I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that the grazing best management practices module is no longer being used by government at the moment, as but during the and to be honest, and this is probably my ignorance, I don't know if that's just in Queensland or that's right across the country. But
I can probably elaborate a little bit, Fiona. This question's actually come from one of our compatriots in New Zealand.
okay.
Just a little bit of background. The Great Barrier Reef issues that we have in Australia, and the impact that practices and other things and climate change having Great Barrier Reef is having a fairly a big impact on policy in Queensland, and in particular some of the rural lobby organisations have been not as impressed with some of the legislation proposed there, and they have actually been reluctant to get involved or support the ongoing delivery of best management practices. So there is a number of political issues going on, which is actually causing some issues there. So that's what I would say. So there are some work still going on in that space, but the word best management practices has been dropped from the vocabulary at the present time.
Yeah.
That doesn't explain it fully for everybody, but I'm happy to discuss that further. There are other questions, however, and I note that, oh, this was to me privately actually, but there was some interest expressed about the knowledge support in terms of social science. So you've alluded to that a few times there, Fiona, about some of the work that you're actually doing. It's very interesting. Did you want to elaborate a little bit further about what sort of support you be provided?
Yes, so I'll just go back a little bit. So so in terms of knowledge support, I'm either providing support through methods. So I've been developing some surveys with, I'll just focus primarily on extension because that's what this group's interested in. So looking at developing some surveys with extension officers and extension groups within Queensland DAF, and also looking at developing some interview questions. In terms of concepts and frameworks and processes, I have developed a number of Excel databases or data sets of concepts that have come out of behavioural economics or social psychology primarily, and then also to a lesser extent human user-centered design and social marketing, about and these are things like cognitive biases, social science theories, persuasion principles. It's a whole range of different things, but things that I think might be of relevance to, I was looking at it from both tool developers, but also extension officers. And depending on the issue, I guess the thing with applying knowledge support is the more details I have about a particular issue that an extension group wants to focus on, the more I can sort of find the most relevant concepts as I see it, or frameworks that I think might be most applicable. So, so for example, and this is the slide I skipped over, but I can just give you a bit of an example. One of the groups was really interested in looking at destocking decisions. And so I had read a bit about behavioural finance, and I looked at some of the insights from behavioural finance, because a lot of stocking decisions are not terribly different. There is some differences, of course, between livestock and the stock market. Most obviously, livestock are perishable, but in terms of some of the ways that decisions are making and some of the stuff that comes out of behavioural finance about some of these biases or errors in thinking, and also strategies to address some of those errors in thinking, I think are applicable to destocking decisions. So as part of as part of that particular workshop, we looked at 4 different areas. We looked at confirmation bias, endowment effect, herd behaviour and sunk cost dilemma. And we looked at how that might be relevant within a livestock destocking decision through drought. And then also what the literature says about how you might be able to address some of those biases. So, you know, again, we looked systematically through confirmation bias, endowment effect, and the rest, herd behaviour and sunk cost. What I like about this, and one of the reasons why I was really keen to look at the knowledge support role, is that there is a lot of, there's a very strong evidence base of rigorously tested concepts and rigorously tested methods from other areas that I think can be applied to ag and natural resource management without reinventing the wheel, and also with a high level of confidence that, you know, these have already been rigorously tested as concepts. So I'm not coming up with new theories. It's just about applying something in a new context, but applying something that's already well understood. So that's what I was looking at, you know, what in the behavioural finance area, which is just one of a whole suite of different areas within behavioural and social science, but within behavioural finance, what are some of the main concepts that I thought might be applicable? So that's how I'm sort of applying it. I'm looking at specific issues or areas in which you know, extension officers want to work, and then, you know, I'm looking at, you know, some insights that I'm able to draw that might be useful. And then the third main area that I've been looking at, apart from methods and concepts, is interventions. So there's you know, there's a lot of interventions, you know, over 500 I've collated, but there's a lot of interventions that you know, have been used in other areas that we haven't traditionally used, or we haven't used to a great deal in extension, that I think, you know, could be used a lot more. And some of that is the message framing, tapping into social norms, using defaults, which is very much part of the nudge approach, but also looking at things like decision aids, such as checklists or cheat sheets or decision trees. Looking at, you know, what they call mental contrasting activities. So where you compare what you like with what you have, and then implementation intentions. So developing if-then plans, looking at planning prompts, cues and reminders. So often, you know, making sure that you prompt the land managers or graziers that you work with about certain decisions, you know, might be one of the ways that you can best support them with their decision making. It might not be an actual issue of information provision or lack of understanding. It might be just that, you know, the sheer cognitive overload of decisions, you know, a helpful, you know, a text reminder at a certain time might be all that it requires. So there are lots of different instruments or techniques that can be used. So again, you're working through.
Sorry, I've just got one more question. We're just on time, actually.
Sorry.
But I have a comment here and a question coming from South Australia, this one. Younger or newer farmers have struggled in droughts in South Australia because they haven't experienced or drawn on knowledge and experience of other farmers. How do we incorporate wisdom while accommodating new strategies? That's a good question.
It is a good question, and I'm not sure that I definitely know that I alone can't answer that. I think there are some, what I will say is I've seen some really interesting programs coming out of not only DAF, but also MLA, and I'm thinking about it from a grazing perspective, you know, about mentoring and linking, you know, more experienced producers with less experienced producers, you know, but having people do it in a voluntary way with, you know, a little bit of structure, but a lot of ability for people to make the system work for themselves. I mean, I think that's useful to all professionals or all people learning, young people learning from older people. So, yeah.
And older people learning from younger people too when it comes to social media, for example. That's
right, yeah.
Look, I will have to pull that up looking at our times. That's been very useful. Thanks, Fiona. There's a few suggestions here which suggest we might get you back. Or it may be, and here's a segue, if extension people out there are interested in future professional development, don't forget to complete the survey that has been forwarded to you in the last day by Ro. We are looking, APEN is looking to implement some further professional development for our members and also people who are not members yet. So please feel free to do that. Again, yes, thank you very much, Fiona, for your time. Much appreciated. I'm sure that there are, now this is recorded, this presentation will be available in a little while from our site. So for those that were unable to attend, they'll be able to follow up on that, or if you wish to go over some material. We look forward to, and I'm sure there'll be people looking forward to catching up with you, Fiona, in the future. So
Great.
thank you very much for your time, much appreciated. And thanks everyone for your participation today.